My name is Tom Dickelman. I'm one of the ministers at the community church, and on behalf of the church, I want to welcome you all to this evening's program, Performance or Wellness, or POW, with Dr. Matt Dewar. A brief word about the community church. It is our mission to provide inspiring worship and compassionate service to the community, and also offer opportunities for spiritual and personal growth. And sometimes we find ourselves in a wonderful position to provide some pretty neat opportunities and programs. That's kind of what this is. This all came about because of a very generous family in our church who has a trust, and they gave us the opportunity to do some neat things. And what was very high on our list beyond some mission things in Waukegan was seeing if we could bring Matt Dewar on board, and they thought that was a good idea. So Matt is a part of our church staff on a part-time basis for the next 2 years, and he'll be doing programs like this, as well as a retreat this spring. We've already talked about the possibility of this spring, right before golf season starts, of maybe having a dinner. And for all the people who are head cases like me when it comes to golf, maybe Matt could provide a little help or inspiration for the upcoming season, or perform a few miracles. So we've got some great things planned and that we're thinking about for the next 2 years. To introduce Matt, I met him first over 20 years ago when he was a student at Lake Forest College. And we became reacquainted when we both spoke at a TEDx conference a number of years back. Matt's day job is as an educator at Lake Forest High School. Some of your children are in his classes or have been his students. Matt has not one but 2 master's degrees, as well as a doctorate in education. They all are in the sort of wellness and health and educational realm. He's also published a book entitled Education and Well-Being, an Ontological Inquiry. Matt advises and consults with organizations and businesses and sports teams in particular. And he's also the president of Journey 30K, which you can find online. He's a sought-after speaker, and we are very lucky to have him tonight, as well as a week from tonight. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for coming. I cannot take credit for this graphic or the title of this presentation. This was Tom's creation. The genesis of this presentation literally was 3 weeks ago, and I was talking to Tom about some work that I had been doing with Lake Forest College football and helping them with mindfulness and performance training, etc. And I was going through all these things I was really excited about, and 30 seconds into the conversation, he said, "We got to get you over at Gorton Center and have people come over and, listen to some of these ideas." And so it's pretty amazing that he can make what he said 3 weeks ago come to fruition like that. So thank you for having me. This was really difficult to put together because I felt, and I think everyone has felt this at a given time, where you're packing to go on vacation and you have 1 suitcase or 2 suitcases, and you have to make all these decisions about what goes into those suitcases because you can't bring everything. It's just a short trip. And so today I'm used to either spending more time or doing a retreat, and so a lot of these concepts could be expanded significantly more if we had more time. So I did my best to kind of give you the most authentic experience in the shortest amount of time. And at the end, I hope that there'll be 15 to 20 minutes where I'm happy to field questions, concerns, insights, etc. So let's rock and roll. as is my custom when I spoke at the church, I don't know, a month and a half ago, and how I often start class, just 2 minutes of quiet breathing. I always think it's a great way to kind of just anchor yourself in the present moment, use the breath as a touchstone to establish an intention for what we want this next hour to be like. So I'll stop talking here in a second, just upright but not overly tense. And if it helps, if you feel fidgety or that your mind is all over the place, just feel free to take your hand and rest it on your abdomen. And just notice your breath. And if your mind wanders off, it's totally okay. Once you've noticed it's wandered off, just come back to your breath. We'll go for 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. So here we are. I think at the heart of all the work that I do is what we just did, is building and strengthening the capacity to slip into presence. And if there's any kind of keystone skill to well-being or to performance, it's the ability to have some level of command over attention. Attention dictates what we pay attention to. What we pay attention to is what we experience. And what we experience is our reality. And so, honoring that and taking time each day to practice attention is something I think we'll talk about more next week. But I don't know that there's any skill more important than that in terms of wellness and performance. I'm going to borrow an analogy from our Taoist friends. And in Taoist philosophy, they often use this analogy of the grain of wood. And if you've ever had a piece of freshly cut wood in your hands, you can run your hands with the grain, and it's very smooth. And if you run your hand against the grain, you get splinters. And this has been the kind of a core Taoist teaching about what it means to live in harmony with the way, the Tao. And so I want to start this talk off with going against the grain, because it seems to be something that we've become exceptionally good at. And we get lots of splinters. And towards the end of this talk, I want to focus more on how it is that we might start to live with the grain, because I think that's ultimately what we want to do. Stress. 2 years ago, I taught 3 sections of a class called Wellness for Life. I had 76 students or something. I surveyed them. I asked them what was the biggest obstacle to their health and well-being. 75 of 76 said stress. When I surveyed, I'm the well-being coordinator for the district. When I surveyed faculty, asked them what was the biggest obstacle to their health and well-being, same thing. Across the board, stress. To say that stress is epidemic has almost become cliche and redundant. We live in a world where it has become a reality. And this really comes to fruition in what is a mental health epidemic? All the major indicators of where we're at with mental health, the numbers are getting worse across the board. And to me, both with young adults as with adults. And to me, what is most alarming, this is the CDC report that was, I believe, just released in July, the beginning of July, for 1999 to 2016. And there was a overall 30% increase in the suicide rate in individuals over the age of 10. And in 2016, 45,000 people took their lives, 54% of which had no prior diagnosis of mental illness. This is a complex problem. I don't for a second pretend to have all the answers or insights into it. But tonight I want to take one angle on it, one perspective that I think might be useful. And so I want to talk about what I personally believe. I'm not saying it's the root of every single one of those instances. But I think it's a recurring problem underneath the prevalent, the omnipresent levels of stress that we have, and the fact that our mental health is seriously declining. And so, instead of just jumping into it, I want to do an exercise with you. And if you have those pads of paper, if you could get them out for a second, I would like you to describe your relationship to time. And I know that's a goofy question. I like to ask goofy questions, and I often get odd looks from my students when I ask some of these questions. The simplest way to do this is just list 5 to 10 words that capture your relationship to time, how you would describe your relationship to time. And if you don't want a bullet point, you'd rather write sentences, stream of consciousness, that's fine too. Done with that. If you're not, keep going. Would you have always described time in this way, or your relationship to time in this way? And if not, when did your relationship to time change, become what it is now? Can you pinpoint kind of a moment in your life where you started to feel that time behaved towards you in a particular kind of way? I don't think this is talked about enough. I think a distorted relationship to time underlies most of our stress. And I want to spend some time kind of unpacking that a little bit. To my students, I always talk about the tyranny of the clock. That we have this thing that just sits on the wall and these predetermined iterations. And I'll say to students, what is it actually measuring? Well, time. Well, what's time? They say, well, it's the hand moving. I said, that's just a hand moving. That means nothing, right? So we have this object that the I believe it was the Benedictine monks in the 12th century created the clock to put the monks on God's time to calibrate, which is hilarious for what the clock became. And then people in the surrounding communities realized how valuable it would be for commerce, and then the clock took off. But so we live under the rule of the tyranny of the clock. And when I have this conversation with young adults, with athletes, with folks of all ages and backgrounds and professions, we inevitably get to this idea of time scarcity. That a part of stress in this distorted relationship to time is the sense that there simply isn't enough time. That we are somehow time's object, constantly under its rule, constantly chasing it, and that it makes our lives not very comfortable. And a part of this, I'd call it a pathology, is this emerging addiction to urgency. And I would call it false urgency. That our consciousness is inundated with these things we just have to do. We have to check that text or that email or what's going on Facebook or Instagram, or my students where in the middle of talking about something really cool like the Odyssey, right, that every 15-year-old should be totally into, just kidding, I'll look over and a young lady will be giving her best selfie to put on Snapchat in the middle of class. And I'll say, what are you doing? Right? Well, I just had to update it really quick. Right? So even at a young age, there's this urgency to have to address things. Again, I think this is symptomatic of this pathology of this distorted relationship to time. With that is a preoccupation with what I would say is the insignificant. So not only is there this sense of urgency, but it's an urgency to address things that really don't matter. And I say that all the time to students. When you have to disrupt class to update your Snapchat, 10 years from now, will that be something that had to be addressed? Will you remember that? Or checking your phone incessantly to see if, I don't know, something happened, right? It's been 5 minutes. So this preoccupation with the insignificant, and I call it the drift cycle. You get time scarcity. It's never enough. There's this addiction to urgency, preoccupation with the insignificant, which often distracts us from the things that we really need to do, so that when we come around, we're like, oh my gosh, there's so much I have to do, and there's no time to do it. So it just compounds the problem, and then we're just stuck going and going and going. And my good friend Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, has an amazing quote, and I think it might be my favorite quote, top 3 of all of Western philosophy. And I'm going to paraphrase it to make it more relevant. He said, the greatest danger in life is losing yourself. Because yourself is not like your car keys or an object or a person. Because yourself can just quietly pass off into the world, and you can go your whole life without realizing that it's gone. And I think a part of this pathology of time and this phenomenon of drift, the real consequence of it is despair. It's a recognition that a significant gap has opened up between a sense of connection and value and where you're at. And I think for some folks, that recognition can be so startling and overcoming that people can do self-destructive things. That can be a very existentially disorienting situation. As a kind of as an aside, but it's totally relevant, my personal story with all this work in the name of my company, which I could talk about later, and if any of you saw the TEDx talk I gave a couple years ago, it's about this, and it's about my grandfather. And when I was a junior in high school, he was diagnosed with bone cancer. My grandmother had already passed away probably a decade before that. So he was alone, and he came to live with us. And so I got to see for the first time, I was also a junior in high school, so I was more aware of what was going on. And I got to see someone come to grips with their mortality and face kind of the closing scenes of the last chapter of their life. And one evening he was sitting in the living room, and he was just in his chair staring out the window. He just started to cry. Never cried. Wasn't that type of emotionally expressive person. And my mom said to him, "Are you okay? Or she said, "Are you okay?" He said, no, I'm not." And she said, "Do I need to call someone?" Thinking maybe something was physically amiss. And he said, "No, it's not that. It's just that I've lived 83 years and I don't know what my life is about. And there isn't enough time to fix it." And so I heard that at, 16, 17, junior in high school. And pardon my language, but that scared the shit out of me. And if I were to map my life out on a timeline, I think there would be a before and after that experience. And so I became fascinated in this idea of drift. And this particular picture, he passed away, and I don't remember if it was a couple days later, a week later, whatever. We were going through his stuff. And so I found this old photograph of him in Florida, fishing, in his youth, in the sun. And as I looked at it, I thought about, this was my grandfather, and yet the last image I had of him was at 83, filled with despair. And the more I looked at the photograph, the more I realized I was, in a sense, looking at myself. And as I wondered if my grandfather ever thought about, when he was this age, if his last chapter would look the way it did, I started thinking about, oh my gosh, what will it be for me? What am I, right? And so the philosophical angst began, and the rest is history. I think it's a very real problem, and in a few minutes I'll talk more about how, even though technology and even though the circumstances that are unique to our time, I think amplify this issue, I think this has been a human problem for a very long time. I don't think this is new in its core. I think the manifestations of it, maybe the acceleration of it might be new, but yeah. So reflection number 2, or exercise number 2. Promise next week will be less depressing, be more uplifting. We'll even have the lights bright, maybe some music. I want you to make a list of the major roles you perform in your life. So, for example, like student, parent, friend, son, daughter, sibling, worker, employee, whatever. Now list those roles in order of importance. And before we move forward, what, if you could articulate for yourself, what makes number one? Like, what criteria do you use to assess importance? What makes a particular role that you play in your life important? And why would you privilege it above other roles? What makes a role insignificant? So there's some sort of value hierarchy that's implicit in this that you're potentially kind of subconsciously or unconsciously assigning. It's probably really important to make it conscious. And again, this is stuff we could spend hours on. I'm ripping you through this, so. You could draw a circle now, like a pie chart, that designates the amount of time each role consumes. So say you identified 7 roles, 8 roles, okay? Draw your circle, make a pie chart now, and roughly speaking, guessing, which roles consume the most amount of time, represent that on the pie chart. When you're done with that, is there a congruency between the importance of roles and the amount of time spent fulfilling them? If your number one role matches most time spent, right, there's some congruency there. If your number 8 is your number 1 in terms of time expenditure, is that okay? It might be. I don't know, right? But it's certainly an incongruency worth looking at and understanding. In my experience, which is of course limited, there does seem to be a relationship or correlation between people who spend the most time doing things that they perceive to be important. Right? Perfect is not an option. That's out the window. Best is the enemy of the good, right? So that's not what we're talking about. But generally speaking, if people are able to spend a good portion of time on things that matter, that tends to bode well for both their well-being and, as we'll talk about more next week, their particular performance, whether they're an athlete, musician, artist, lawyer, physician, whatever. And I think what I'm trying to fundamentally get at here is a perspective restoration. Going back to that drift cycle. I think what happens when we get stuck in the drift cycle, in this false sense of urgency, and we get caught up in the insignificant, is our perspective narrows, and it narrows, and it narrows, and we only see right in front of our faces. And when you're only living in the immediacy of the moment, or the immediacy of the urgency of the moment, you forget the kind of bigger view of your life. What do you value? What's important? Where do you want to go? And so the work that I do, I often sometimes describe it as insight and strategy. And everyone wants to jump to strategy, because strategy's easy. Give me a technique, give me an exercise, everything's better, I'm going, right? Sure, in the short term. But if the larger perspective, the framework that you're using to guide your life is not where it needs to be, your strategies are doomed beyond just the immediate. And so what we're talking about is restoring a wider perspective so that we can then narrow into the particular strategies that actually work for us. As an undergrad, I actually double majored in religion and philosophy. One of the things I thought that was so cool was that the Latin root of religion means to bind back or reconnect. And William James, who wrote the book The Varieties of Religious Experience in the early, I believe it was the early 1900s, late 1800s, kind of opened up the study of comparative religion. And in that book, he describes religion in the broadest sense. And he said basically there's two premises to every religion. There's something of ultimate significance, and there's a way of connecting to it. And I thought that was fascinating. And what I realized in the course of reading that and in studying religion is that in every tradition, there is this diagnosis of the human condition. There is this acknowledgement that we tend to lose the perspective that we need to live our best lives. And then the religion offers a corrective for that. It moves us back into the space we need to be in alignment with ultimate significance, which is, I think in every tradition that I know of, a relationship with something larger than yourself. And prioritizing that connection with whatever you envision that to be, putting that kind of in the red hot center of your life, and not Snapchat or Facebook or whatever seems urgent in the given moment. And so I want to kind of take this last part of this talk into the realm of connection, because I personally believe that that's what we're after more than anything, is connection, a sense of belonging. Alfred Adler, the psychologist, said the goal of all behavior is belonging. I have to remind myself of that all the time when I have freshman boys doing very strange things in class. I have to bring up that quote and remind myself that that's just a misguided attempt to connect, which is, it is. I mean, it really is. But I have to remind myself that nonetheless. And so our last kind of little reflection here, I want to talk about what Albert Borgman, who teaches philosophy at University of Montana, he's written about this. He calls these focal moments. Moments that bring into focus that significant sense of connection in our lives. And with students, I often use the analogy of a fire. Is you're in that space of a focal moment when you feel the warmth of connection. It's intuitive. It's juiced into our DNA. We are so social. And we are so attuned to each other and to a sense of presence beyond just our day-to-day human affairs. And so we know when we're entering into that space of connection. We feel the warmth if we're paying attention. And we know when we're cold and we're at a distance from that warmth. And so this last reflection, again, we're speeding through this stuff. In the retreat in the spring, be able to roll up our sleeves and dig deeper and take more time. But I want to leave with this last reflection, going back to that analogy of the grain. What are some things we can do now to go with the grain, to move or lean into connection? And so if you could identify and list the activities that produce an ultimate sense of connection to yourself, others, and time. Connection to time, as I understand it, in a positive sense, is lost sense of time. When we lose time, and the ancient Greeks talked about this with the notion of kairos. It was different than chronos, which was calendar time or chronological time. Kairos was this time of deep, profound connection, the right moment where something special was happening. So identify and list the activities that produce an ultimate sense of connection to yourself, to other people, and to time itself rather than just being its subject. Second step, and if I'm cutting you off and you're still going, feel free to keep going. Identify and list the people that produce an ultimate sense of connection to yourself, others, and time. John O'Donohue, the Irish poet and philosopher who passed away about 10 years ago, had an awesome way of talking about, he would ask, when was the last time you were in the company of another person and left that connection and it just sung in your mind for weeks after? Right? Where are those moments? Where are those people? And sometimes you don't know, which is why you reach out to someone new. And the third is identify and list the places that produce an ultimate sense of connection to yourself, others, and time. I sometimes say this to my students, this doesn't necessarily have to be a geographical place. It can be a place you go with literature, with music, with something. You can open up a territory within yourself that's a wonderful place to visit. So that can count as a place just as much as Florida. And last, what would your time chart, your pie chart look like if connection were your number one priority? If you just identified the activities, the people, and the places that provide that sense of warmth to your soul. If you're, what would your life be like if you privilege those activities, people, and places over the unnecessarily urgent? So, redundant, but I think one of the most important things anyone can do for a wellness practice, calling it a wellness practice is, just as a life practice, is to think about your schedule in terms of connection. How can I build connection into my schedule? And I think doing that immunizes you to this pathology of time that we talked about previously. Personally, one of the things I try to do, and it's hard to do, I try to meditate 30 minutes in the morning. Wake up, meditate 30 minutes, and then in the evening before I go to bed. And is that easy? No. Do I enjoy it all the time? No. But do I ever walk away from doing it feeling like I didn't do what was most important? No. Never. And for me, and I often offer this, and I'm not saying you have to meditate. That, for me, that's what's meaningful. For you, it can be whatever's meaningful for you. But I think there's a power to bookending. If you want to start somewhere, bookend the day. Start with connection, end with connection. Because the wisdom of cultural and religious and spiritual traditions has shown that those are really important times for priming kind of the mind, morning and night. But research now shows too that the way experiences begin and the way they end dictates how you perceive the quality of everything that transpired in between. They've done all sorts of really interesting experiments with that too, by the way. I could go off on a tangent, but I won't. Tom's raising his hand and I'm going over time already?
No, because I don't worry about that anymore.
I thought you were just about to subject me to your clock time.
My question is, when you have that meditation time in the morning or the meditation time in the evening, when you orient your time around connection, does that provide you a connection with yourself? Does it provide you meditation, a connection with spirit? What is the connection you experience?
Good question. Before I answer it, I'm going to go on a quick tangent because my back just got really warm. You guys know Christmas Vacation, the movie?
Yeah.
You know when the tree gets lit on fire accidentally? And Uncle Lewis is walking around, his back's on fire, and he doesn't know it? I kind of feel like I might be Uncle Lewis right now. There's just like flames coming off my jacket that just kicked up. Back to your question, Tom. For me, I've come to a place where I believe that connection is not something that needs to be created. It's something that's ever present. The difference in whether or not I experience it is if I'm attuned. And so I could very easily look at 30 minutes of sitting on a stool just like this at home, facing a wall, just like this, following my breath as a terribly selfish, self-centered thing to do. And I've gone through that in my own head, right? I could be spending time with my wife, with my stepson, with the dog, whatever. But I know what I am when I do it, and I know what I am when I don't do it. And practicing being receptive to myself, my thoughts, my feelings, etc., becomes a springboard for being a better listener to my wife, to being more patient with my stepson, who's 11, and never stops making incessant music, rap sounds, anything. Just he's like a human noise machine, and it's just going nonstop, right? So it allows me to roll, like all these little things that we live with on a daily basis that drive us crazy, right? I'm not driven crazy when I'm committed to my practice. And my wife, she sees the value in it too, in me, sees how different I am, and just and then I go to school and I have however many kids, my particular students, my course load, but then all the other students I work with and everything. And so for me, what it does is it allows me to stay at a level where I can keep connecting throughout the day and keep leaning in to connection that's already there, instead of closing up and being like, nope, no more. And so that's just what I've come to. I like to end, I don't know if I'm providing too much information. If you don't care or whatever, stop me. I won't be offended. I like to end each sitting too, in the morning and in the evening, with identifying something that's very obvious that I can be grateful for. My house, my car, wife, clothes, whatever. And then I like to identify something that actually makes me think. Something that I probably throughout the course of the day totally didn't even notice. And so I take time to kind of go through and kind of slow the frame of my day down, the frames of my day down, and then be like, wow, that person actually said something to me that was super kind, and I acknowledged it, but I didn't really receive it the way I should have. That was really awesome. And then that's an opportunity not only to acknowledge it, but to circle back the next day and say, hey, you helped me out with something and I didn't even ask. You just saw me, which is often the case, looking confused at my computer, and you just came over and fixed it without, whatever. And then I end with some sort of intention for what I want to put forward in a given day. So that's my thing. But it could be reading, it could be writing, it could be whatever your thing is. And for whatever amount of time is appropriate to you. But again, the key is that I think doing this immunizes you to the pathology of of a distorted relationship to time. Is that if you build connection into your day and you honor it, the way time relates to you and the way you relate to time changes. It's not perfect. It's not like you're hovering 6 inches above the ground with a golden aura everywhere you go. But I think you navigate the difficulties of day-to-day life with more integrity, more patience, more compassion. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't know that there's anything better than that out there. So I'll take those things. Last, I do this thought experiment exercise with my students. I say, imagine a jar with 30,000 pebbles in it. They say, why 30,000? And I tell them that the average person lives about 30,000 days. And this morning when you woke up and you thought, oh, I just want to go back to bed. When I think about being in Dewar's class first period, I just want to slam my face into the wall, right? You're in the process of pulling the pebble, a pebble, out of the jar of your life. And there's no do-overs or putbacks. And we're not even guaranteed the 30,000, right? That's just a rough estimate. And we so easily fall into this routine of mindlessly wishing time away as if it were a renewable resource. And as I saw my grandfather as a junior in high school, at some point we're going to wish we had the time we wished away. Or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll be in a good place, right? But it's possible that at some point we'll really want the time that we wished away. And I think that's again, when talking about wellness or performance, mining for insights that will help us find the right strategies to do the right things and perform in the way that we want to. I think that's a thought experiment that I know I return to on a daily basis and share as often as I can, because I think it's an important one. That we should be grateful for what seems so given to us, which is time. Right? Next week, we'll talk more about the architecture of performance, what it means to perform, how we can perform at a higher level, what are tools we can employ, and how this work this week ultimately prepares us to put ourselves into high-stakes environments, because that's ultimately what performance is. It's deliberately putting yourself into an environment with increased stress to test your capacity. And if you're a true performer, you're finding those zones, those channels where you don't actually know if you have the capacity to meet the challenge, and that's what's exciting. And if you don't have this work that we talked about today, if you don't have a handle on it, I think when you get into those high pressure environments, you're way more easy to crumble. As Nietzsche the philosopher said, those who have a why can endure almost any how. Meaning if you have a why, you are much more equipped to take on stress, suffering, difficulty, adversity, because you see beyond it. There's a context beyond the difficulty. When I explain this in class, I talk about when I used to coach cross country. If you've ever been around the finish line of a cross country meet, it is the strangest thing in the world. I remember the first time I was not a cross country runner, right? So I became a coach. I was like, sure, I'll coach cross country. They asked me. I thought it'd be great. And I remember the first meet, these kids are running down at West Campus. The final, it's like 200 straight yards. Their faces are contorted. You can see the lactic acid taking over their muscles. They can hardly move. And they're just going. And then they fall across the finish line and they're throwing up, they're coughing, they're rolling. And I'm like, do we call 911? What's going on? I had no idea that this was normal. This was like your standard race. But the takeaway is, would any of them be able to push their body and mind to that limit if they didn't have a goal? if they didn't have a finish line, if they didn't have a why, which the clock is right there at the finish line, and they're saying, I want to beat my PR, or I want to beat this one more person who's in front of me. And so having that why, having that sense of purpose allows you to get into that space of performance that's rugged and tough and handle it in a way that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And so we'll talk about that more next week. Thank you. If you want to visit my website, journey30k.com, 30k being 30,000 days. Journey 30,000, the journey of our lives.
Yeah, we have 6 minutes, 11 seconds left.
So this isn't like...
See if anybody, a quick question or two, and then
Sure.
I'll speak. Does anybody have a question that they want for Meg?
People observe other people's time differently.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that within the sense of urgency and that almost a dopamine effect of, am I going to miss something? Am I going to be left out of something?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge topic. I explain to my students that when you interface with a website or with an app, a social media app, I say to them, you no longer have free will. And they say, of course I do. And I said, no, you really don't, because what you don't understand is 30 of the world's best neurobiologists figured out how to make that screen and your interface with it absolutely irresistible to processes in your brain that you are completely unaware of. And they call it the dopamine lollipop, right? You go, I mean, why when you get a new message, is it red? Pops up red. Why is it red? Is that just random? Everyone likes red? No. It's because your brain sees red, and that's an enticing color. It immediately takes note. So again, this is a huge topic, but the omnipresence of technology, sure, there are many benefits, but there are a lot of consequences, and some of them are because it's so portable and the interface is so accessible that our ability to create spaces like the one you just mentioned, where we, a sacred space, sacred time, where we push the world out and we lean into each other and have a sense of community or family or whatever, that's really an endangered species of experience because it's going extinct with the interface with technology getting more and more convenient. And as Sherry Turkle talks about, people who are digital natives, like my students now, who have grown up with technology, they've never have known the world before technology. She calls it, they live with the assumption of divided attention. That it's just assumed you're not going to be fully present to whatever it is you're doing or whomever you're talking to. But that's okay, because we all have this kind of tacit agreement that if my phone message comes up, that's more important than my connection to you, and vice versa. So, okay, cool. Which means all of a sudden the most important thing to human beings, which is connection and presence to each other, is now just shallow. Because there's this expectation that it'll be interrupted for something better and more urgent that I got to respond to. So yeah, it's I don't know if I just spoke to that or just rambled incoherently.
Shared agreement that we all had societally that like things shut down. It feels like there's no more shared agreement.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
The only shared agreement is the assumption of divided attention. We've all agreed, not consciously but inadvertently, that we're all going to be okay with being interrupted.
So I can interrupt you now?
You don't want me to go 20 minutes over like I did at the last service?
No, that was fine. You went over. Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be here 7 o'clock next week. If you want to take the pieces of paper that you have with you, if you want to leave what remains of the pad on the table. One thing I do want to say is kudos to the wonderful folks at Gorton. We called them 36 hours ago and said, Well, you know, we thought we'd have 25 and we have 65. And they sort of did a wonderful job of moving mountains to make the Stewart Room available. So thanks so much to the folks at Gorton, and thanks to Matt. See you on Sunday.
Thank you.